England's defeat has sent an expectant nation into mourning, but a minority of fans resorted to creating trouble. 3 English players have been targeted with racist abuse on social media following their miss in the penalty shootout. England players Jadon Sancho, Marcus Rashford and Bukayo Saka were all targeted. The Football Association says it's appalled by the abuse and called on the government to bring in legislation to punish those guilty. Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who was at Wembley for the final, also condemned the abuse and called for the players to be lauded as heroes. He tweeted, "The England team deserve to be lauded as heroes, not racially abused on social media. Those responsible for this appalling abuse should be," he says, "ashamed of themselves." Excitement among fans had been building since the round of 16 win over old rivals Germany. Celebrations had continued since the semi-final win over Denmark, and fans started gathering across London for an afternoon of revelry ahead of the evening kick-off at Wembley on Sunday. Leicester Square became an unofficial fan zone, with riot police having to intervene at times after some fans tried to set off fireworks. The assembled crowd threw beer bottles at police. And then at Wembley, a few ticketless fans broke through the security cordon and made their way into the stadium, fighting with other fans and stewards. England's Football Association's condemned those gatecrashers, calling them an embarrassment to the national team. London's Metropolitan Police has made 45 arrests and is working to identify those who did break in. For more on this now, we're joined by WION correspondent Benji Hire, who's in London as well. And Benji, as well as the condemnation of the behaviour of the badly behaved minority of fans, are there also questions for authorities around the security operation for the match?
Yeah, Ollie, a real shame that such an occasion was slightly marred by these really ugly scenes in the build-up to the game. It has to be said that it was expected that many fans would descend on those London landmarks, such as Leicester Square, or indeed go to Wembley itself in the build-up to kick-off. And yet the police operation that was in place at Wembley effectively allowed tens of thousands of fans, many of whom didn't have tickets, to congregate in what's known as Wembley Way, that big boulevard up to the stadium entrance. And there was a party atmosphere, and there were flares, and there were people celebrating in anticipation of that game. But many of them, as I mentioned, didn't actually have tickets to the match, some of which, as you mentioned before, tried to kind of barricade their way into the stadium and did so successfully, getting past that barrier of security guards over the turnstiles and finding their way into the ground, even though the Met Police insist that many of those were ejected subsequently. And there's another concern too when talking about the police operation that was in place and the way that some of the fans were handled, and that's coronavirus, of course. We are still in the midst of a pandemic in the UK. We're still in the state of lockdown until that full reopening on the 19th of July. And even though there were protocols in place at Wembley, those attending officially had to either have had a vaccination or had to prove they had a COVID negative status. Many of the other guidelines were not really abided by or enforced. I was down at Wembley shortly before the game begun, and the tens of thousands of fans that were either waiting to go in or just there for that party atmosphere didn't seem to be socially distancing very much, and that was the case too at many of those landmarks around London. So questions will be asked of the police operation from a security perspective and a COVID one too.
And Benji, England manager Gareth Southgate's been speaking today. What's he been saying about the racist abuse received by some of his young players?
That's right, Ollie. In the past couple of hours, Gareth Southgate holding that press conference, a really sombre and reflective tone that he struck, as you can imagine, after what was an agonising loss for England. And he was asked about those racist posts directed at some of his players. His response was very firm. He said that it was unforgivable and it's not what England stands for, choosing to instead praise the national team for being a unifying beacon of light. That condemnation echoed by the Prime Minister Boris Johnson and the Football Association as well. They described this sort of abuses as appalling and disgusting. The Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, going even further, in fact, by calling on those social media companies to take action and to prevent the hate and this sort of abuse of being put up in the first place, essentially putting safeguards in place on a number of their platforms. And we've seen support as well from a number of football clubs across the country. For example, Bukayo Saka, that young winger who has his penalty, I should say, England's final one, decisively saved by the Italian goalkeeper Donnarumma. He plays for Arsenal, and the North London club has put forward a statement in which they've highlighted their praise for the young winger and said that they are proud of his efforts throughout this tournament. And equally, we've seen Manchester United back their striker Marcus Rashford, another of those players who have taken the penalty, unfortunately missed, and been on the receiving end of that abuse. So the good news, if you can look at it in that way, the kind of silver lining, is that there's been a huge amount of support for these players by the clubs, by the different organisations, by politicians, and indeed amongst the majority of fans as well.